So I would say the risks of proof of stake and proof of work are, so first of all, proof of work is not just a consensus algorithm, it's also in some ways an extremely efficient, extremely censorship resistant, extremely accessible and anonymous one-way exchange. And that, you could say arguably kind of improves the accessibility of the token. And that's something that proof of stake totally does not have. Another thing is that you have this kind of weak subjectivity requirement, which basically, practically speaking, basically means that the first time you log on, unless you kind of trust honest majority assumptions, the first time you log onto a system, you would have to find some like kind of out of band way of figuring out what the current tip of the chain is, and then after that, if you don't want to kind of repeat that out of band process, you have to make sure that you log on at least once every couple of months. Then there's some, people also sometimes raise issues around kind of wealth inequality and kind of the rich getting richer over time and so forth. And on the one hand, I think those issues are much less worse than some of the biggest detractors say, because with basically, if you think about it, proof of stake, take 1 million ether, you get it you get 1.08 million ether out. Proof of work, take 1 million ether, turn it into a huge pile of hardware, use that to earn even more money, and then convert the money back into Bitcoin. So kind of Matthew effects exist, regardless of whether it's kind of in band or out of band. But at the same time, it is something that's worth considering. Considering you don't want to make algorithms that accidentally have kind of too much centralization concern.
Yeah, Dominic.
Yeah, so I think, proof of work always leads to centralization, and we've seen this. So, in any decentralized network, you need to find a way to mediate participation, right? And trivially, mediate participation, somebody would just consume all the resources, right? So Bitcoin or proof of work systems do this by effectively making the cost of electricity or the value you have to expend through burning electricity in ASICs, the thing that mediates participation. The problem with this, of course, is that some people have electricity that's much cheaper than others, right? And as we know, most mining takes place in Inner Mongolia, Sichuan. Sichuan, yeah, he speaks Mandarin. It's extremely centralized. There's a handful of miners who control the majority of the network, and this can't be a very good situation. And as Vitalik says, you make money and then you reinvest it in your mining hardware. And if you've ever seen the photographs from inside these mining operations, they're vast. You see the Bitcoin mining machines stretching off to the horizon, literally. I think addressing this centralization problem is a huge, will provide huge progress. The other thing, of course, again, Vitalik mentioned this, that in today's proof of work systems anyway, once you've acquired 51% of the network, you can just attack it ad infinitum, right? And there's nothing really you can do to prevent the attacker just stopping the network functioning. With a proof of stake, it's not quite true. You can actually introduce a thing called puzzle towers. There is a way that you can solve this with proof of work, but no one has. But it's much easier to do with proof of stake network. You can, in extremis, if an adversary acquires 51% of the network or whatever he requires to stop it, in principle, the network can hard fork, and you can just delete his mining identities or whatever it is that he's using to participate. And this is actually a manifestation of this sort of theory of Sybil resistance, that you've got 3 E's of Sybil resistance, right? You've got the first E, which is entry cost, second one, which is existence cost, and the third one, which is exit penalty. So if you look at Bitcoin, it's only 2 E Sybil resistant, right? You've got entry cost, you've got to go buy your ASICs, right? Cost money, that's a first hurdle. The second one is existence cost. The ASICs don't work on their own. You've got to pump all this electricity through them in order to continue participating. But there's no exit penalty. If you get 51% of the network and you bring it to its knees, there's no penalty that can be inflicted on you. You've still got your mining hardware and you've still got access to your cheap electricity. In a proof of stake network, you've got an entry cost. You've got to buy the stake. The existence cost is a bit more dubious. It's sort of opportunity cost and capital cost, although you can introduce other kind of mechanisms to increase existence cost. But by these kind of slasher methodologies or hard fork slashing, you can introduce exit penalty. And this completely changes the game. It produces a situation where the adversary now has unbounded costs, right? Because the network hard forks, he starts acquiring more stakes so he can disrupt the second network. But it hard forks again, and he's got to start all over again. He's back to square one. And so I think the myth, there's a bit of a myth out there that proof of stake networks aren't as secure as proof of work, and I think that's not true. They do have some vulnerabilities, notably that the adversary might try to create an event that depresses the price of the participation token on the markets and then acquire the stake he requires to make his attack cheaply. And there are a few other things like that. But overall, my view is that proof of stake is more secure than proof of work. And fundamentally, it certainly has a lot more potential in relation to producing high-performance scalable networks because it removes this terrible, dastardly Poisson distribution thing, which makes it almost impossible to design efficient network protocols. So I think the move to proof of stake is huge for decentralization. It just needs to be done in the right way.
Thanks. Jay?
Hey, so the question was about what are the
what are the actual challenges or cons to deploying a proof of stake network?
Yeah, I think fundamentally maybe the most serious challenge is actually having the algorithm such that it can be fork accountable. So what I mean is, like, in Bitcoin, you have to expend the work in order to even contribute to consensus at all. So there's a natural cost to even participating and therefore even attacking it. And proof of stake is very tricky because there's no cost to signing, a signature. So instead, we have to make do with algorithms to ensure that the security is guaranteed as long as the amount of malicious signers is small relative to the whole pool. But not only that, but we also have to figure out what happens when the system gets attacked. Like, what happens when there is a significant majority who it may be less than 50%, but it may be more than 1/3, so something like 40%. What happens if 40% are malicious and want to destroy the system? You have to have an algorithm that can guarantee that you can find out who is responsible for the attack. And so I think that's the challenge. It's proof of stake or BFT algorithms are already complex. It's a field littered with failed algorithms that people thought were correct, but turns out were incorrect. I think it's a challenging thing to come up with something that is bulletproof. In fact, we didn't invent Tendermint out of thin air. We took pieces of research that had been vetted for decades and built it through pieces that were already there. We take care not to use any advanced cryptography. So you can even implement Tendermint with no advanced cryptography at all. You could just do it with hash functions actually. So I think that's it. Just having an algorithm that is simple enough that people can feel secure about it, and having a system that has absolute guarantees about its security.
Thank you. And then Peter.
So I agree with most points that were raised before me. I would add two main things. So one is difficulty of designing all the incentives. Right now we can penalize in addition to reward the participants. So make it so that people are actually willing to participate in the staking process. They are willing to participate enough. So based on the risks that they have and based on the rewards they are getting. So it might also change across time. So sometimes there might be periods of increased risk of, for instance, slashing. How do we make sure that the stake doesn't go down significantly and make the network even more vulnerable? And similar issue comes from the fact that there is a value associated with the token, the staking token. So also any external shocks to the price of the token, how do they affect the staking? I think it's difficult to design all the incentives so that they are aligned to keep the network going.
Thanks, guys. And then we're almost out of time, so I have another question that I'm directing towards Timo and Vlad. I guess Vlad's closer, so I'll ask him to answer first. With all of these discussions and all these topics, something has come up, and even in contemporary proof-of-work discussions around Ethereum, it comes up. Governance of the blockchain. How do you govern any blockchain in general, but does proof of stake add any pros or cons to the governance story with regards to how does not having proof of work make it easier to govern a blockchain? Does it make it harder to govern a blockchain? And Vlad, you can.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I would say that in general, whenever a consensus protocol has failures, you have to know how to recover from it. Sometimes in proof of stake protocol that will be involved like just placing more security deposits. Sometimes it'll involve a hard fork. And it could be said that proof of stake requires hard forks in more cases to recover because of finality. And if you have inconsistent decisions, then at least one of the clients will have to hard fork. However, I think it's also worth noting that if a proof of work blockchain got reverted for a significantly large number of blocks, that I think the social consensus would probably deal with a hard fork. So basically, I guess on a broad stroke with respect to proof of stake, governance needs to understand the failure modes and be able to recover from them. And I think that our ability to actually have confidence in the fact that we can recover from failure modes is super critical for us to actually get a good deal. Because I think one thing that is important about proof of stake protocols is that they're much more economically efficient, and we can have a much lower cost of consensus than we have now. But if we believe strongly that we can recover from failure in using the social layer, then we can bring down the cost of consensus even more. Right? We can maybe expect to have a failure every 6 months and have the consensus cost 10 times less. And that might be something that we could do if we had that kind of confidence in governance. If we don't, then maybe we're willing to pay 10 times more in order to have to deal with that less often. But definitely, I think the relationship between the governance and the consensus protocol is a super interesting topic that I think proof of stake kind of demands that we look at in a way that proof of work doesn't, because proof of work kind of just lets you have a in protocol recovery, just make a longer chain, whereas proof of stake has cases where hard forks are required by nature of the protocol rather than just by nature of the social convenience.
Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe just to add two aspects. So first of all, for governance, some form of voting is required. You can either vote with work, or you can vote with your stake, or you can create identities for voting, and those identities in turn can be created either by proof of work puzzles or by a stake deposit. So I think governance can be based on both. You can also, another aspect, think about, you have, when you're the governance, you're responsible to keep the network alive, or the governance, you're making decisions, and the outcome of the decisions should be beneficial for the network. So you can argue that if the voting is based on proof of stake, that it's actually the stakeholders who should be deciding the fate of the system. So you may think that it's somewhat more natural to base the governance on the actual stake rather than work, which is somewhat external to the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my kind of personal philosophy on this question is that I don't believe that coin holder interests are aligned with the good of the protocol, and so I think that putting governance in the hands of coin holders or miners as opposed to hard forks is incredibly dangerous, because hard forks require the consent of a larger group of people than coin votes and miner votes, because coin votes and miner votes just require like those stakeholders, whereas hard forks require a broad community consensus. And so I'm generally, very concerned about coin voting because I think it entrenches whales as like the kings of crypto, and I'm much more optimistic about hard forks, which I think require broad consent and public debate.
Yeah, I would actually like you to reply, Dominic.
So I'm not making any claims about what the best approach is, but it's just worth mentioning a different approach which we're adopting. So we've sort of abandoned the idea of hard forks. We've got this idea that the protocol can be continuously upgraded and that this should happen transparently for dApps and users of the network. So the way it's very simple, actually, the way it works. The client, so you can imagine a client like Geth or Parity, is wrapped in a reverse proxy, right? And so, the dApp would talk to the reverse proxy rather than the client. And the reverse proxy is aware of this thing, the blockchain nervous system, for which you can just substitute any governance system, right? And this thing can specify a protocol upgrade in some number of blocks, and the reverse proxy will download the client with a matching hash and, at the appropriate moment, depower the old client and boot up the new client. And the idea is that the users of the network aren't even aware this is happening, right? So ultimately, in this situation, we sort of optimize for technical evolution, and obviously the blockchain nervous system is making these decisions, and it's doing this through neurons and follow relationships, which are ultimately controlled by the owners of the neurons. So this is a kind of control by proof of stake. So in that case, the protocol is owned and the network's owned by the proof of stake holders. But there is a different way of looking at this, that things like the protocol itself, economic parameters, all of this can actually be controlled by the stakeholders indirectly through some kind of algorithmic decision-making process. And it's not something that requires some kind of huge community agreement to upgrade the client.